You have woken up as a different person before, not metaphorically. You know the feeling of the version of you at 7 a.m., barely upright, saying nothing, wanting nothing but silence. And the version of you 8 hours later, sharp, talkative, certain of things the morning version couldn't even remember caring about. Somewhere between those two, you call both of them me. But they don't think the same. They don't want the same things. They wouldn't even make the same decisions. You've felt this so many times you stopped noticing it. The quiet suspicion that the you keep referring to isn't one continuous thing at all. It's something that keeps happening, again and again. You called that inconsistency. What if it was never inconsistency? What if it was the most literal thing about you? The one part of this whole experience that physics might actually be able to explain. Think of the last time grief and laughter sat in the same afternoon. You've had a day like that, standing at a funeral, hollow, barely able to speak, and then an hour later laughing at something small a cousin said, genuinely laughing, before catching yourself and feeling guilty for it. Both of those were you, fully you, not a performance layered over some more authentic version underneath. If the self were really one continuous solid thing, that kind of whiplash shouldn't be possible without something breaking. Nothing broke. You just kept happening differently moment to moment, the way you always have. That's the paradox this video sits inside. Somewhere in a small, controversial corner of physics and neuroscience, a handful of serious researchers have asked a question most of us never let ourselves ask out loud. What if consciousness isn't produced the way a computer produces output? Steady, continuous, running in the background, whether you're paying attention or not. What if it's closer to an event? Something that has to happen freshly again and again, thousands of times a second, and what you call yourself is just the pattern those events leave behind, the way a strobe light leaves the illusion of a solid moving shape. If you've ever been told you're too inconsistent, too moody, too hard to pin down, you weren't broken. You were accurately describing physics you didn't yet have the vocabulary for. That's not an excuse, it's a correction. Most people spend years trying to solve this the wrong way. They go looking for the real me like it's a lost object, buried under trauma, under people-pleasing, under whatever coping mechanism got built in childhood, convinced that if they just dig deep enough, excavate long enough, they'll finally hit something solid and permanent underneath. Some spend small fortunes on that excavation. Retreats, journals, years of searching for a bedrock self that, this video is going to argue, was never down there to find. This explains something you've felt your whole life and never had language for. It doesn't yet explain why the illusion is so convincing, why a self built out of flickers feels from the inside like the most solid thing you own. That's where this gets interesting. I need to say something honest before we go further, because this topic tempts people, including me for a long time, into false certainty in one direction or the other. Either science has basically proven consciousness is quantum, it hasn't, or this is New Age nonsense dressed up in physics vocabulary. It isn't, not entirely. The actual territory is messier, and I'd argue, more interesting than either extreme. I spent months reading papers on this before I trusted myself to talk about it on camera, because the line between real, testable physics and appealing metaphor is thin here, and I didn't want to be one more voice blurring it. There was a version of this video I almost didn't make, because the honest answer to is consciousness quantum is, we don't know, and we might not be able to know for a long time. That's an uncomfortable place to start a video from. Most content in this space skips past the discomfort and hands you a tidy conclusion instead. I'd rather hand you the actual shape of the uncertainty, because I think the uncertainty itself is where the useful part lives. So let's be precise about the actual problem first, because the problem is not controversial, only the proposed solutions are. Beat. What exactly are we even trying to explain here? Here's the problem, stated as plainly as it can be stated. Neuroscience is extraordinarily good at telling you what happens in a brain. It can show you which regions light up when you feel fear, which chemicals spike when you fall in love, which circuits misfire in depression. What it cannot do, what no lab on Earth has managed to do, is explain why any of that is accompanied by an inner experience at all. Why does a pattern of electrical signals feel like anything? Why isn't the whole system just running in the dark, doing its computations with no one home to notice? Imagine a machine built to be functionally identical to you in every measurable way. It flinches from pain, it says ouch. It avoids the stove after touching it once. Philosophers use a version of this thought experiment and call the imagined result a philosophical zombie. Something that behaves exactly like a conscious being while having no inner experience at all, no felt quality to any of it. Nothing it is like to be that thing. Nobody can prove such a machine is impossible. And the fact that we can't rule it out, the fact that behaves conscious and is conscious aren't obviously the same claim, is itself a clue that something about subjective experience sits outside what physical description alone accounts for. This gap has a name in philosophy of mind, the explanatory gap between physical processes and subjective experience. A philosopher named David Chalmers gave the specific difficulty a memorable label decades ago. He called it the hard problem, to distinguish it from the easy problems of mapping brain function to behavior. I want to be careful here. Naming a problem is not solving it. Chalmers didn't prove consciousness is anything in particular. He proved convincingly that our best models of the brain leave something out, and that something is the very thing you're using right now to watch this sentence. So if you have ever tried to explain to someone why you feel like more than your biology, why a full account of your neurons still seems to be missing you, you weren't being unscientific. You were pointing with your own intuition at a gap that formal science admits it hasn't closed either. This is bigger than a semantic quibble among academics. It shapes how you're allowed to talk about your own inner life. Reduce consciousness entirely to biology with nothing left over, and you've quietly implied that everything you feel, love, dread, the specific weight of missing someone, is just chemistry performing itself, with no remainder worth taking seriously on its own terms. Leave the gap open, honestly, the way the actual science does, and you've made room for the possibility that the felt quality of your life is a real feature of reality, not an illusion your brain is running for no reason. That's not a small difference. That's the difference between treating your inner life as decoration and treating it as data. Not a glitch in your thinking, a gap in the model. I'll admit something here that I don't say often on this channel. There was a stretch of my own life, long enough to be embarrassing to admit, where I genuinely wondered if I was the philosophical zombie. Not dramatically, not as a crisis, just as a quiet background question during a period when everything I did felt correctly performed and strangely unfelt. I went through the motions of a full life and kept waiting for the felt part to catch up to the doing part. It eventually did. But the gap itself was real, and it taught me that the hard problem isn't just an academic puzzle. For some people in some seasons, it's a lived and unsettling question about whether the lights are fully on. This is where two physicists decades ago made a proposal so strange that most of the neuroscience establishment still treats it with open skepticism. Not because it's obviously wrong, but because it's almost impossible to test. And strange as it sounds, understanding why it's so hard to test will tell you something true about your own mind, whether or not their specific theory turns out to be correct. Ready for where this actually goes? Picture an anesthesiologist standing over an operating table, decades into a career built on a strange, uncomfortable fact he can't fully explain to his patients. He knows, almost to the molecule, which drugs will switch off a person's consciousness. He knows the dosages, the timing, the reversal agents. What he doesn't know, what almost no one in his field can tell you with confidence, is why those specific molecules, interacting with those specific structures, cause the lights to go out on subjective experience while leaving the rest of the brain's machinery humming along. Heart still beating, reflexes still firing. Anesthesia works. Nobody fully agrees on why it works on consciousness specifically. That gap bothered this particular anesthesiologist enough that he went looking for an answer outside his own field. His name is Stuart Hameroff, and in the late 1990s he partnered with the mathematical physicist Roger Penrose to propose something that neuroscience at the time considered close to heresy. That consciousness doesn't arise purely from neurons firing in patterns, the way a computer's logic gates produce a calculation. Instead, They proposed it emerges from quantum-level processes happening inside microtubules, tiny protein structures that form part of a cell's internal scaffolding, present in every neuron in your brain, normally thought of as nothing more than structural plumbing, the cellular equivalent of scaffolding on a construction site. Their theory has a name: orchestrated objective reduction, usually shortened to Orch-OR. The core claim is that these microtubules can sustain quantum superpositions, a kind of both-and state, where a system holds multiple possibilities open at once, rather than being locked into just one, and that consciousness itself is the moment those superpositions collapse, snapping from many possibilities into a single definite outcome. Penrose's contribution was specifically about why that collapse would happen at all. He proposed it wasn't triggered by outside interference, the way most physicists assume collapse works, but by gravity itself, at a threshold built into the structure of space-time. Hameroff's contribution was locating a plausible where, a biological structure delicate enough and organized enough to host that kind of event, thousands of times a second, inside a living brain. Here's what that would mean if it were true. Your sense of a single continuous you wouldn't be built the way a brick wall is built. Piece stacked on piece, permanent, solid. It would be built the way a heartbeat is built. Not a thing, but an event repeating so fast and so consistently that it feels from the inside indistinguishable from something solid. I want to pause here and be exact about what this theory does and does not claim, because this is the point where most popular explanations quietly lie to you. Orch does not claim that quantum mechanics causes free will, or that it proves the soul exists, or that meditation activates your quantum brain. Hameroff and Penrose made a specific, falsifiable, at least in principle, claim about a physical mechanism inside a specific cellular structure. That's a narrower claim than most people repeating it online seem to realize, and narrower claims are actually more respectable in science, not less. Here's where you should notice something about your own reaction. If part of you just relaxed a little at the idea that your mind might be built on something as strange and unresolved as this, pay attention to that. It usually means you've been carrying an assumption that consciousness had to be either fully explained already or entirely mystical, with nothing honest in between. This theory occupies the in-between. So might you. So does the evidence support it? This is where you need to sit with some discomfort, because the honest answer is not conclusively, and a significant number of physicists think the theory has a fatal flaw. The most famous objection comes from a physicist named Max Tegmark, who in the early 2000s ran the actual numbers on how long a quantum superposition could realistically survive inside the warm, wet, chemically chaotic environment of a living brain. His calculation suggested those superpositions would collapse through ordinary environmental interference, a process physicists call decoherence, in a timescale far too short to have anything to do with the slower electrical rhythms of actual thought. In blunt terms, your brain, according to this critique, is too hot and too noisy for the kind of delicate quantum coherence Orch-OR requires, the way a whisper gets lost the instant you try to carry it across a crowded, shouting room. There's a reason this specific critique lands so hard, and it's worth sitting with before we move past it. Tegmark wasn't dismissing the idea out of instinct or bias. He did the math. He treated Orch-OR the way physics treats any proposal, as a claim that has to survive contact with numbers, not just contact with intuition. That's what makes this a genuine scientific dispute, rather than a matter of taste. Both sides are doing real physics. They're just landing in different places. Where does that leave the theory? Dead or just unproven? Hameroff and later collaborators have pushed back, pointing to newer findings about quantum effects surviving in warm biological systems, like photosynthesis in plants, which does appear to use quantum coherence at working temperatures to move energy through a leaf with startling efficiency. That finding reopened the door slightly. It did not settle the argument. As of now, Orch-OR remains a minority position, taken seriously by a real but small slice of physicists and neuroscientists, and treated as unproven, possibly unprovable with current instruments, by most of the rest of the field. No brain scan has isolated a quantum signature of thought, No experiment has definitively ruled the mechanism out either. That's not a satisfying place to land, and I'm not going to pretend it is just to give you a cleaner story. I'm telling you this not to deflate the idea, but to protect it from becoming something it isn't. You don't need Orch to be literally, mechanistically true for the pattern it describes to be worth taking seriously. And that's not a retreat. That's actually the more useful version of this conversation, because it means you don't have to wait for physics to finish arguing with itself before you can use what this idea reveals about you. Not certainty, a working pattern. It's worth asking why this specific, narrow, hard-to-prove theory generated so much public fascination in the first place, when dozens of other neuroscience hypotheses about consciousness barely make it past academic journals. I think it's because Orch does something almost no competing theory does. It locates the mystery of experience at the smallest possible scale, inside the very cells doing the thinking, rather than treating consciousness as some emergent fog that appears once you stack enough neurons together and hope. Whether or not the mechanism holds up, the instinct behind it, that the answer might be granular, moment-to-moment, event-sized, rather than one giant continuous hum, turns out to matter more than the specific biology Hameroff and Penrose bet on. Here's what it validates, regardless of which side of the debate eventually wins. Even our most rigorous scientific attempts to locate a fixed, continuous self inside the machinery of the brain keep running into the same wall. Not because scientists are bad at their jobs, because the thing they're looking for, a stable, unchanging object called you, may not be the kind of thing that exists to be found. What if the real discovery isn't a structure at all? What if it's a rhythm? Let's bring this out of the lab and into your actual week, because here is where the abstraction either becomes useful or stays trivia. If consciousness, whatever its true mechanism turns out to be, behaves less like a fixed object and more like a repeating event, then something you've been doing to yourself for years suddenly looks like a mistake in reasoning, not just a bad habit. You take your worst moment, the version of you that snapped at someone you love or froze during the interview or said the thing you regret at 1 a.m., and you promote it. You treat it as the real you, the one that finally slipped past the performance and revealed the truth underneath. Meanwhile, the calm version, the generous version, the version that handled a crisis with actual grace, you file that one under good day, as if it were the exception and the collapse was the rule. Notice the accounting error in that. You never apply the same standard both directions. Nobody, after a good week, turns to themselves and says finally, "My true nature is showing." We reserve that verdict exclusively for the collapses we're ashamed of, as if shame were somehow more reliable evidence than everything else you've ever done. But if the self is genuinely event-like rather than object-like, that hierarchy doesn't hold up. There is no deeper, truer collapse hiding beneath the others waiting to be exposed. There's just the collapse that happened, in that moment under those conditions, followed by the next one and the next, each drawing on a slightly different configuration of fatigue, chemistry, memory, and context. Not one true self behind a mask, not a mask hiding a true self. Just successive events, none of them more you than the others by default. Think about someone rebuilding themselves after something that ended cleanly and violently. A marriage that collapsed, a job that vanished overnight, an identity built around being the reliable one that stopped fitting the moment reliability stopped being enough. In the weeks right after, that person usually does the same thing you do after your bad days. They take the wreckage and call it the truth. This is who I really am underneath it all. Someone who gets left, someone who fails, someone who was never as solid as I thought. They collapse the story into the worst possible outcome and then treat that outcome as the permanent architecture of their identity. What they rarely get told, on what almost nobody tells them, is that the collapse they're grieving was never the foundation. It was one frame in a sequence that is still running. The next frame hasn't happened yet. It is not predetermined by the last one. Not a wound, a frame. Consider the opposite case too, because the mechanism cuts both ways. Someone finally speaks up in a meeting after years of staying quiet, one sentence, unremarkable to everyone else in the room, and something in them shifts permanently. They don't think of it as a fluke, they think of it as evidence. That single collapse becomes the seed of a different pattern, rehearsed just enough times that it starts to feel like personality rather than event. Nobody warned them that identity could be built this deliberately, one repeated collapse at a time, in either direction, toward contraction or toward expansion. Most people only ever notice the mechanism working against them. It works exactly the same way in your favor, the moment you start feeding it different material. This is where the binary gets stuck. Either you keep treating your worst frame as your foundation and your best frame as an exception, or you start treating every frame as equally provisional, equally revisable, equally just a frame. You don't get to choose which one is more scientifically accurate. The event model doesn't play favorites. It just keeps producing whatever gets rehearsed most. That single reframe, self as sequence, not self as verdict, is not comfort for its own sake. It's a more physically honest way to describe what a self actually seems to be, according to the very science trying hardest to pin it down. And if it's more accurate, it's also more useful, because it means the worst version of you doesn't get to cast a permanent vote on who you're allowed to become next. There's a practical test for whether you've actually absorbed this or just nodded along. The next time you do something you're not proud of, notice the sentence your mind reaches for automatically. If it's some version of typical, of course, this is just who I am. That's the object model talking, treating one frame as a verdict on the whole reel. The event model reaches for a different sentence. That's the collapse that happened under those conditions. Same behavior, completely different architecture underneath it, and only one of them leaves room for the next frame to go differently. This isn't about lowering the bar for your own behavior either. That's the objection people raise first. So let's meet it directly. Treating a bad moment as one frame instead of a verdict doesn't excuse the moment. You can still apologize, still repair, still hold yourself accountable for what that specific collapse cost someone. What it prevents is the second injury, the one where you take a single bad frame and use it to sentence every future frame before it's even had a chance to happen. There's a difference worth naming precisely. Accountability looks backward at one frame and asks what it cost. Identity, the way most people practice it, looks backward at one frame and asks what it proves about every frame still to come. The first is honest and necessary. The second is a category error dressed up as self-awareness, and it's the one costing you the most quietly, every time you let a single bad hour write the review for a life still very much in progress. So if identity isn't a structure you protect, but an event you keep re-triggering, what exactly is doing the triggering? What decides which version of you shows up next? Here's the mechanism, and it doesn't require Orch to be literally correct for it to be real, because it operates on a level even the skeptics of quantum consciousness don't dispute. Every single moment of your life, you are collapsing possibility into actuality. Not metaphorically, structurally. Before you speak, multiple sentences exist as live options. Before you act, multiple responses are available to you. The instant you choose one, the others don't get archived somewhere for later. They simply stop being possible. That branch of reality closes. Something that could have happened, didn't, and now never will, in exactly that form again. You do this thousands of times a day without noticing. The same way you don't notice your own heartbeat until someone asks you to. And because you don't notice it, you underestimate what it means. It means you are not a passive witness sitting behind your eyes, watching a movie called Your Life that was already filmed. You are, in the most literal sense available to you, the mechanism doing the collapsing. There's a philosopher who arrived at a version of this centuries before quantum mechanics existed, using nothing but pure reasoning about the nature of reality itself. Spinoza described existence as a single unified substance, what he called Deus sive natura, God or nature, meaning the two aren't separate things but the same thing seen two ways, and he argued that everything within it, including you, is driven by what he named the conatus, an inherent striving to persist, to actualize, to keep becoming rather than simply being. Spinoza wasn't describing quantum mechanics. He couldn't have been. The mathematics didn't exist yet. What he was describing, in the vocabulary available to a 17th century philosopher, was the same underlying shape. Existence is not a finished state you occupy. It's an ongoing act of becoming that requires continuous participation to keep happening at all. That's the bridge between a controversial physics theory and a 300-year-old metaphysical claim. And here's why the bridge matters to you specifically, right now, in whatever room you're sitting in. If collapse is happening constantly, and you are the one doing the collapsing, then the version of yourself you keep defaulting to, anxious, small, apologizing for taking up space, bracing for disappointment before it arrives, isn't a fixed trait you're stuck reporting on. It's a pattern you keep reselecting, often unconsciously, often out of familiarity rather than truth, the way a hand keeps returning to a habit it never chose consciously in the first place. Ask yourself honestly when that pattern last got a genuine competitor, not a good mood, a genuine alternative collapse held long enough to leave a trace. If you can't remember one recently, that's not a character flaw. It's just a system running the only pattern it's been given to run. This is not the same as saying just think positive or manifest a better version of yourself. And I want to be direct about that, because this channel doesn't traffic in that kind of promise. Collapse isn't wishing. It isn't visualization alone, and it isn't optimism as a personality trait. It is closer to what happens when a musician who has practiced a difficult passage thousands of times finally stops thinking about individual notes and simply plays. The choice of each note has been so thoroughly rehearsed into the system that it no longer feels like choosing at all. It feels like being. That's what a repeatedly collapsed pattern becomes, not a decision anymore, but an identity. Which means the identity you currently experience as fixed was, at some earlier point, just a decision that got repeated long enough to stop feeling optional. Here's the part that tends to unsettle people more than comfort them at first. If identity is rehearsal rather than essence, then there's no original, authentic self sitting underneath all your patterns, waiting to be uncovered once you strip enough conditioning away. A lot of self-development content sells you exactly that promise. Dig past the noise, find the real you underneath. The event model says something quieter and, I'd argue, more freeing. There was never a real you buried under the patterns. The patterns, repeated enough times, are the only kind of self that has ever existed for anyone. Which means you're not excavating, you're building, right now, with whatever you rehearse next. So the question was never, why am I like this? The question was always, which collapse have I been rehearsing and am I still willing to rehearse it? Not a wish, a repetition. And repetitions can change, not instantly, not by force of will alone, and not without friction. A pattern rehearsed for 20 years doesn't dissolve because you noticed it once on a Tuesday. But every single collapse is a fresh opportunity for the pattern to bend slightly, not break, bend. And enough small bends, compounded across enough repetitions, is the only mechanism, physical, psychological, or otherwise, by which anyone has ever actually changed. Think about what that means practically. The next time you catch yourself mid-pattern, the sarcastic response forming before you've even decided to say it, the withdrawal starting before you've registered your hurt, you don't need to defeat the whole pattern in that instant. You only need this one collapse to land slightly differently than the last one did. That's it. That's the entire unit of change available to any of us, physicist or not. One collapse, bent slightly, repeated on purpose, until the bend becomes the new default. This is also why willpower alone fails so often, and why people blame themselves for that failure instead of blaming the strategy. Willpower tries to override an entire rehearsed pattern in one dramatic act. Quit the habit outright, become a new person overnight, delete 20 years of repetition through sheer determination on a Monday morning. That's not how collapse-based systems change, in physics or in you. They change through accumulated small deviations, not single acts of force. The musician doesn't fix a lifetime of habit through one furious practice session. They fix it by playing the passage slightly differently, thousands of times, until the new version is the one that comes out automatically. Your identity updates on the same schedule, not instantly, compoundingly. Zoom out for a second and look at what this actually reframes. It's not just your bad days, It's every plan you've ever abandoned because change felt too slow to be real, every time you decided a small shift didn't count because it wasn't dramatic enough to prove you'd transformed. Under the event model, the small shift is the only kind that has ever counted. Drama was never the mechanism, repetition was. But wait, this isn't a claim that you can collapse your way into anything you want simply by wanting it hard enough, and I want to close that door clearly before it gets pushed open. The conatus, Spinoza's striving, operates within real constraints: your history, your biology, the actual structure of the situation you're in. Collapse isn't magic. It's selection among genuinely available options, not manifestation of impossible ones. What it does give you reliably is more range within those real constraints than the object model of the self ever let you believe you had. That loop we opened at the very beginning, the one about whether your inconsistency was ever really inconsistency, closes here. It wasn't malfunction. It was mechanism. The flicker was never a flaw in the design. The flicker is the design. I want to talk to you directly for a moment because I think I know why you're still watching. You're not here because you needed a physics lesson. You're here because some part of you already suspected the self wasn't as solid as everyone around you insists on treating it. Maybe you're in a season right now where you genuinely don't know who you are anymore. After a breakup, after a diagnosis, after a move, after simply outgrowing a version of yourself that used to fit and now feels like a coat 2 sizes too small. And the people around you keep asking you to just go back to who you were, back to normal. As if who you were was ever a fixed destination instead of a frame that already played and already ended. You don't need to go back. There's nothing back there to return to, only a sequence of collapses that already happened, doing exactly what they were always going to do, finishing and making room for the next one. Maybe nobody's said this to you plainly, so let me. The discomfort you feel right now, the not knowing, isn't a sign that something's wrong with you. It's what the space between 2 frames actually feels like from the inside before the next frame has fully formed. Every person who has ever gone through real change has passed through this exact nameless middle. Old pattern already gone, new pattern not yet rehearsed enough to feel like anything. It's disorienting precisely because it's honest. There's no performance left to maintain in that gap. Just you and whatever collapses next. You are not lost. You are between frames. And between frames is not nothing. It's the only place anything new has ever been built. I'm not going to tell you this part is comfortable because it isn't, and I'd rather be honest with you than soothing. Nobody hands you a schedule for how long the gap lasts. There's no formula that tells you exactly when the next frame stabilizes into something you can call yourself again. What I can tell you, from everything this video has actually shown you, is that the gap is not evidence you've lost something permanent. It's evidence the mechanism is doing exactly what it has always done, closing one collapse, opening the space for the next, whether or not you can see where that next one lands yet. If you're in that gap right now, let this be the thing you take with you when the video ends. You don't have to know who you're becoming to already be in the process of becoming it. The process doesn't wait for your certainty. It was never asking for your certainty in the first place. So go back to that first image, the 2 versions of you, morning and evening, that don't think the same or want the same things, that you've quietly filed under the same name your whole life without asking why the filing made sense. It made sense because you were never one thing pretending to be consistent. You were a sequence of honest events, each one true to the conditions it arose in, stitched together by memory into something that only looks like a single, unbroken object from the outside. The way a film looks like continuous motion, when really it's thousands of still frames, each one complete, each one gone the instant the next one arrives. Every loop this video opened closes right here. The gap neuroscience couldn't explain, why any of this feels like something, doesn't get solved by Orch, but it gets reframed. The feeling is the collapse, not a byproduct sitting on top of it. The controversy between Hameroff and Tegmark doesn't get resolved either, and it shouldn't be, not by a video. But you now know exactly what's actually being argued about, and why it matters less to your life than the pattern underneath it. And the funeral, the laughter, the 2 of you that felt too different to share a name. That was never inconsistency. That was the mechanism working exactly as it always has. Physics may never fully settle whether that flicker happens at the scale of microtubules or somewhere else entirely. That argument will likely outlive this video by decades, but you don't need the physicists to finish arguing before you can use the one thing every side of that argument agrees on. You are not a monument. You are a motion, not a fixed thing performing continuity, not a lost thing waiting to be found, a rhythm choosing itself again, right now, in whatever you do the second this video ends. There's a version of you that's been waiting for permission to stop defending a self that was never actually under threat, because there was never a fixed structure there to protect in the first place. There's nothing to defend. There's only the next collapse arriving on schedule, whether you've decided what to do with it yet or not. Not a monument to protect, not a wound to prove, just the next frame, arriving anyway. If that rhythm is worth protecting, if you want to keep collapsing toward the version of you that's actually becoming something, instead of the one just repeating out of habit, subscribing is how you tell yourself that on purpose. Tell me, which frame are you in? The companion ebook, The Quiet Force, goes deeper into how repeated collapse becomes identity. Next video, what happens in the space between two frames?